Okay, we're really happy to have everyone here for this edition of the CEBRA Inflation Drivers and Dynamics webinar. My name is Dominic Smith. I'm one of the organizers, along with Raphael Schunle of Brandeis University. Today we have two great papers, and the session is going to be moderated by Mathieu Pedemonte from the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. And without further ado, I'll hand over the mic to him so that he can introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Dominic, and special thanks to the organizer, Raphael Schunle from Brandeis University and Dominic Smith from the BLS. So just to introduce a little bit the format, the webinar is 45 minutes, where we're going to have two presentations of 15 minutes each. And at the end, we're going to have a Q&A section of around 10 and 15 minutes. Please write your comments in the Q&A space or on the chat section we're going to read at the end. You can just start putting your question as soon as you want. And then at the end, I will read them and ask them to the presenters. The webinar is also live stream in the CEBRA YouTube channel and recorded, and it's going to be available in the CEBRA webpage. And just a disclaimer, participants in the CEBRA webinar do not constitute or imply an endorsement, recommendation, or favoring endorsement of the views, opinions, products, or services of the Central Bank Research Association or any other participating institution, individual, or entity. All views expressed during the CEBRA or CEBRA co-hosted event are strictly those of the authors, discussant, and other participant, and not those of CEBRA, the co-sponsorship institution, or any other participating institution. So today we have two amazing speakers. So we're going to have Gillian Brunet, that is an assistant professor of economics at Smith College, and also Hugh that is a research economist at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So we're going to start with Gillian, that is going to be presenting inflation, war bonds, and the rise of Republicans in the 1950s. So Gillian, please share your screen, and the floor is yours.
I'm trying to get it to share again, but maybe this won't work.
So we can see your slides, but they're not full screen.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to do.
I think this is fine though.
Okay, this will be fine. We'll get through this. It's better not to waste time. So thank you for having me. My name is Gillian Brunet. I'm an assistant professor at Smith College. This is joint work with Eric Hilt and Matt Jaremski. And so we are kind of thinking about a big question. The big economic question we're thinking about is, when we have inflation, do asset losses in real terms affect people's political preferences? And so we look at this in the setting of kind of World War II through the 1950s, where during World War II, there were just huge, very successful bond drives that the government convinced Americans to buy a whole lot of bonds to help support the war effort. It financed, I want to say, about 12% of World War II was financed through bond sales to individuals. And they convinced people that these were really good investments. People bought tons of bonds, and then there was a lot of inflation after World War II that eroded the value of those bonds. And so purchasing power ended up being, more than 10% below in real terms what it was when people first bought these, even though they looked like a very good investment on paper when people bought them. And so people were very angry. It was a very salient issue. Not so much in the 1948 election. It's kind of marginally significant there, but then really mattered in the 52 and 56 presidential elections. And so what we're going to show is that counties where there were more bond purchases during World War II shifted towards the Republicans by a larger margin in the 1952 and 56 presidential elections. I won't show you the congressional results, but we see the same thing in congressional voting patterns. So here is we do it, using 1944 as kind of the leave out year, interacting county bond purchases with year, and you can see there isn't much pre-trend, but 52 and 56, there's a huge effect. Well, a significant effect. It's not decisive. 1952 and 1956 were not close elections. So it didn't change the outcome of that election, but it probably accounts for like 1 or 2% of voting, is a standard deviation. And so that could be very significant in a close election. Just briefly, war bonds had a nominal return that averaged out to 2.9%. It was kind of backloaded to push the debt service after the war. 10 years of maturity, it was the best security offered in terms of highest return compared to anything else offered from the federal government during World War II. We're going to look specifically at E-bonds, which could only be purchased by individuals. Institutional investors had to buy other bonds that had less good terms. And they also had limited purchases to $5,000 maturity value per person per year. Okay, median income was only around $3,000, so this is actually quite a lot people could buy, but it's not. This is something with very broad middle-class participation, not highly concentrated among the wealthy, and so that's going to help explain our results. Is that a lot of people held these, potentially as many as 80 or 90% of Americans held E-bonds. They couldn't be transferred, but because they were registered bonds, but they could be redeemed early, and in some cases were. They're selling these to finance the war, but they're also trying to reduce inflationary pressure during the war by getting people to save more. They're reducing wartime consumption, then there's less competition for resources or consumption at a time where production of civilian goods is very limited. They're also using these to advertise and, for a propaganda campaign to make the war more popular. About half are sold through payroll deduction programs, and about half are sold through bond drives. You can see there's quite a bit of geographic variation. This is not driven by the South. This is, in some ways, you can think of our story is we're telling you about the part of the breakdown of the New Deal coalition that was outside of the South, what is happening in the rest of the country to reduce support for the Democrats. This is very separate from what's going on in the South. We can drop the whole census South and get the same results. So yeah, very intense propaganda bond campaigns. You can have a lot of fun looking at these bond posters. And as of 1945, this looks massively successful. You have between 60 and 90% of Americans participating, unprecedented savings rates. It really exceeds everyone's expectations for how well this can work. And surveys from the time say people really bought into the idea that these bonds were a long-term investment. But then we get a lot of inflation. So 1946 to 1948, that was anticipated. This is after you take off wartime price controls, after you end rationing. But deflation is widely expected to follow. Up until World War II, every major inflation was followed by a significant deflation. And they did see a small deflation in 1949, but it was a year or two later than expected and much smaller than expected. Prices only fell by like somewhere between 1% and 3%. It was very small, whereas people had expected like a 20% deflation at some point. And then in 1950, the Korean War starts. There is another huge wave of military spending, and we get another big wave of inflation and dramatically shifts inflation expectations. And so we have kind of just a very rough measure using the surveys of consumer finance. So it just asks, do you think prices will go up, go down, or stay the same? And so we just have the margin by which people think how many more percent of respondents think we'll have inflation versus deflation. So you can see there were expectations of deflation that were actually realized in here, perhaps less realized than people expected, but still there was deflation. And then the Korean War starts. These surveys are done in January and February, and so this is well before the Korean War. And then we see, starting in 51, lots of inflation, and expectations move to match the inflation we see. And so here's what this means for bonds. The nominal return path on a bond purchased in June 1944 is shown in blue. You can see it's quite healthy, looks very good. We have forecasts from the Livingston survey starting in 46 using 1 year ahead forecasts. The forecast path looks a lot better, right? It's not as good as nominal, but it's not terrible. And there's really is this sense of inflation's going to go down. We're going to see positive returns. Hold on to this. Your returns will get better. And as you can see, that's really not what happens. That inflation is persistently higher than people expect. There's both less deflation and then more inflation. And the result is very negative real returns. Whereas if you hold it to maturity, you're going to end up with like minus 13%. And if you're redeeming it, around the 1952 election or the year leading up to that, you're potentially taking a real loss of 20%. And so that's a really, really substantial, and it's really salient. And so we have evidence from opinion polls that people are very aware of this. It's a top campaign issue. In 1952, the Republicans run on stopping inflation, and the Democrats are creating inflation. I will say there is some justice to this, given that Harry Truman is resisting the Fed's reassertion of independence and stopping them from raising rates in 1950 until there's the whole brouhaha that ends with the Fed Treasury Accord. Just a fascinating history. And then in 1956, the Republicans run on having successfully stopped inflation. And so here is the change in Republican votes over between 44 and 52. So the realignment of the South is not going to be what we're picking up. We have state fixed effects, that's kind of going to go away. It's this pattern in the Midwest and Northeast and out West where bond purchases are going to align very nicely with kind of county level variation within states. And you can see that the echoes of the same pattern going back and forth when you look at the e-bond purchases. So first we'll just do OLS and looking for each election. This is without really controls, but we see what I showed you. And then we're going to do a more sophisticated kind of diff and diff, but where we add a lot of controls, where we interact each control with a post-44 indicator. And what we're going to end up with is that there is quite a significant effect that, if you increase your bond purchases per capita by $100, you're going to see the Republican vote share go up by, between 14 and 15%. I'm going to point out the median county has $128 per capita in e-bond purchases. So that would be quite a large change in bonds to see that. But it's substantial and highly significant. What's really interesting is we can also look at, okay, what was the change in your bank accounts per capita in the county in the same year, where we can measure e-bond purchases. And there's a similar effect, which, you might think is kind of a wealth effect or an income effect, but it's consistently half or less the size of the coefficient on e-bonds. I will tell you the distribution of these two variables is almost identical. The medians are almost identical. There's something about the bonds that they're just much more salient than bank account saving. And so, we find that a 1 standard deviation increase in bond sales is associated with, a 0.9 percentage point increase in Republican vote share. So this is very statistically significant, but it's not a massive effect. And because these weren't close elections, it's definitely not deciding the elections. But in a very close election, you could see this mattering quite a bit. You might think that you don't like OLS for bonds, bond purchases, that there's a lot of other things driving those. And so we use World War I bond subscription rates as an IV. So these bond campaigns were organized locally, local committees, and they, took lessons from what they'd done in World War I and used those for how they implemented these bond campaigns in World War II. And so we can use World War I participation rates, with a bunch of controls for circa 1940 economic conditions. We think this is plausible because what you're really getting variation from is the marketing approaches. So we lose a lot of locations, but we have a lot of variation left. And we're going to see, if anything, stronger results when we use this IV. Just briefly, we think, could this be something like patriotism? And can we control for World War II volunteering? And that doesn't really make much difference. And so you basically say, hey, this program was really successful in the short run. Policymakers at the end thought this was kind of ideal. Wide participation, you got people to save a lot. In other work, we have another paper where we found that this is not just shifting money out of deposits, but there seems to be some increase in overall saving, coming from this bond program. And, so it looks really good. But then all the inflation comes and it erodes the assets that people have bought, and it erodes their trust along with the value of those assets. And voters are very responsive to this. So that's all.
Thanks a lot, Gillian. Very, very interesting paper. But let's move to our next paper before asking some questions. So now we have Hugh Montag from the BLS presenting the post-pandemic drivers of inflation.
Okay. Can you guys hear me?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
But we cannot see your slides. There you go. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to be presenting a paper that I'm working on jointly with Daniel Villanis at the Federal Reserve Board about how firms have been changing prices during and after the pandemic. Okay. So, and the inflation rate has been somewhat volatile recently. And we are interested in looking at this volatility and asking what can it tell us about how firms are adjusting prices, what models best explain this, and what firm behavior do we see? Do we think best explains why we see this most recent inflation? So for the 2 decades before the pandemic, the inflation rate was relatively low and stable. And many of the papers studying firm behavior use this period to kind of estimate how firms update their prices. Since the pandemic, there was a period where inflation was quite low, and then afterwards where inflation was unusually high. And so what we're doing with this paper is we want to revisit this topic now that we actually have this case study of high inflation to see, do the ways that firms update their prices match with what we thought, we thought they would behave before, and just in general, how flexible have firms been in responding to this post-COVID inflation. So there's generally 2 kind of frameworks for thinking about firm price setting. The first is that firms have a kind of a target in mind for their optimal price, and they face some sort of a friction to adjusting their prices. Either it costs money to actually update their prices, or obtaining information is a bit difficult. And so firms only change prices when their optimal price is very far away from their current prices. The second version of how firms update their prices is that firms just have some probability of updating their prices. That depends on how long it's been since they last updated their prices, and it has nothing to do with how far their prices deviate from their true optimal prices. So this is which model is more accurate is important because they have different implications for how firms respond to a pandemic, a positive aggregate demand shock, and they both have different implications for how this most recent bout of inflation played out. The consensus so far has been leaning towards state-dependent models with some modifications. But like I said previously, there really hasn't been a lot of time variation pinned out to identify these different models in US data. Nakamura and others go all the way back to 1978 in the 1980s to try and tease the two apart. Alvarez and others look at Argentina data, but there hasn't been a lot of recent work done trying to identify these differences. So what we do is we use the microdata underlying the United States Consumer Price Index to identify price changes and create measures of the price changes. So what we calculate is how frequently are prices changing. That is, what fraction of prices change in a given period. What is the size of price changes conditional on prices changing? So what's the average size of price changes for all prices that do change? How many of these price changes are increases and decreases? And then how do these price changes vary both within spending categories and across spending categories? Theoretically, we then turn to a basic Glossop-Lucas menu cost model and set it up to be calibrated on the pre-COVID environment. And then we ask, how does this model respond to recent inflation? What predictions does it make? And more generally, what's the pass-through of inflation to the frequency of price changes? So this model is you should be thinking about one of these state-dependent models where firms update their prices when they get very far away from their optimal prices. The CPI microdata comes from the Commodity and Services Survey, so it covers all, or at least most spending categories excluding shelter. And in a typical month, there's about 90,000 individual prices. These prices, these quotes are separated into about 300 different categories, which go down to the finest of men's suits, cheese and cheese products. What we do is we calculate statistics by category and month, and then we aggregate these statistics across categories using expenditure weights. One of the advantages that this data set has over some other data sets is that because it covers a very wide group of categories, it goes beyond just things that you can buy at a grocery store. This data lets us observe how prices for an individual good change because these field economists keep resurveying or attempt to keep resurveying the same good and again and again and again. And we exclude any product substitution or sales from our analysis. Okay. So our questions are, each period, what's the fraction of prices that change? So that's the extensive margin, the decision of firms to update their prices. How many of these are price increases and decreases? And how does this co-move with inflation? Our sizes are the average size conditional on price changes. So conditional on making the decision to change your price, how big of a price change do you make? And likewise, how big are price increases compared to decreases? And then thirdly, our measure of dispersion is the variance or standard deviation across and within product category, where we use a coarser definition of product category when we're building these statistics. And for this, we're interested in asking how important were aggregate versus sectoral forces. Okay, so this is data that goes until June of 2023. What we can see is that pre-pandemic, both frequency and size were relatively stable. During the pandemic, the frequency of price changes briefly increased before stabilizing again. And then as inflation rose, the frequency of price changes rose and fell with inflation, while the size of price changes was relatively more insensitive. Looking at the importance of increases versus decreases, we see that throughout the period, there is some variation in the fraction of prices of goods that see their prices decrease. But a lot of the variation we're seeing in price changes is being driven by price increases, particularly after 2021. So this would be firms are seeing that the inflation rate is higher and the prices of their competitors perhaps has increased. And so they're responding by increasing their prices as well. This variation in the frequency is something that's more typical of a state-dependent model or a menu cost model, because this reflects the fact that firms seem to be choosing when they want to adjust their prices instead of just adjusting them at some fixed schedule. Lastly, or next, we graph the magnitude of price changes. So the absolute value of price change is conditional on prices changing in the dotted black. And this line has been relatively stable as well. And so what this means is that when firms are updating their prices, either by increasing or decreasing them, they seem to be changing by the same magnitude each period, even as the inflation rate rises in 2022 and 2021. So our interpretation here is that this also kind of lends credence to a state-dependent model that firms seem to have some sort of an inaction region and about how far their current price can deviate from their optimal price. And whenever they hit this region, they update their prices. And then lastly, we have just the size of price increases and price decreases separately. And although it's quite volatile, they're quite volatile throughout this period. They roughly seem to have a constant average. Okay, so this kind of summarizes up the graph so far, which is that most of these results seem to be leaning credence to a menu cost model, particularly the changes in the frequency of price changes. These are also similar to what Nakamura and others found when they looked back at the tail end of the great inflation period of the 70s and the 80s. This also implies that the degree of price dispersion didn't significantly increase in 2021 and 2022. And so the welfare implications from firms being unable to adjust their prices optimally should be relatively small under a many cost model such as this. We perform two further exercises. So we ask ourselves, what would happen if we constructed the inflation rate using our data set, but we held the fraction of firms updating their prices to be constant? And then we also ask ourselves, what would happen if we constructed an inflation rate using our data set, where we held the size of price changes to be constant and allowed the fraction to change? And so we're hoping to use this to kind of get a sense about which of these two margins is more significant for explaining how inflation has been behaving recently. We also look at the dispersion of price changes. If the recent inflation was driven by aggregate shocks, so everyone saw their costs increase by 10% or their demand increase by 10%, that would push all the firms to increase their prices, and then we would expect to see the dispersion of price changes fall. On the other hand, if the recent inflation was driven by sectoral shocks, we would expect to see the between sector dispersion of price changes increase. And so what we do for our second exercise is we just take the standard deviation for price changes within each category and compare that against the standard deviation of price changes across categories. Okay, so first for the decomposition, what we find is that if you hold the size of price changes fixed and allow the fraction to vary, there's not a lot of volatility in this inflation rate. While if you hold the frequency fixed and allow the size to vary, the volatility is much higher. I should remind you that this inflation rate is calculated using our data set that we pulled from the CPI microdata. So this is not the official BLS CPI inflation rate. Our interpretation here is that a lot of what's going on is the switch from price decreases to price increases, where the rising share of price increases is very significant for explaining what happened in 2021 and 2022. And if you just hold this average size conditional on price changes fixed, you don't really do a good job of explaining the change in firm behavior. Our second graph shows the between sector and within sector dispersion. And both of these lines are relatively flat, which runs a bit contrary to the prediction that this is mostly driven by aggregate shocks and the prediction that this was mostly driven by sectoral shocks. So we're still working on trying to incorporate this into our model. One possibility is that there was a mix of both that was significant for explaining why firms chose to increase prices in 2021 and 2022. Turning to the model, this is a relatively standard Gulf-Lukos model. Households have quasi-linear utility and consumption preferences, SCS consumption preferences. Firms encounter some idiosyncratic productivity shock with a Poisson probability. They have to pay a fixed cost to reset prices, and nominal demand follows random walk. I've displayed the firm profit function, where you can see the fixed menu costs that firms have to pay to update their prices, as well as the nominal demand process. We calibrate our data to match U.S. non-shelter CPI pre-pandemic period. We use existing parameters for consumer preferences, and then our firm technology process matches the pre-pandemic statistics for is set to match the frequency and absolute value of pre-pandemic firm pricing changes. We have two exercises, which are we simulate our model in a partial equilibrium setting and then feed it the actual inflation rate over the time period to see how see what the model predicts the frequency of price changes is. And then we simulate a general equilibrium model where we allow the long-run trend inflation rate to vary to see what the average frequency of price changes is under different average inflation rates. So this table shows our results for our partial equilibrium results calibrated on the pre-pandemic pricing statistics. We generally match the frequencies and the sizes pretty well up until 2020. And then when the pandemic and the post-pandemic inflation happened, our frequencies don't increase nearly enough to match the uptick in firm price changes. In particular, we don't match the frequency of price increases, nor do we match the increase in the frequency of price decreases. So from this, this is one of our big takeaways from the model, which is that this menu cost model, firms are behaving more flexibly in 2021 and 2022 than this menu cost model would predict they would using the data we have pre-pandemic. Okay, for the general equilibrium results, we feed in on the table on the right, the graph on the right, we resolve the model for different trend inflation rates. And we, on the y-axis, is the average frequency of price changes. And we can see that there is a positive relationship between the frequency of price changes and the trend inflation rate, but it's not as steep as what we see in the data. Right, so in summary, this recent bout of inflation provides an interesting opportunity to test recent models of price setting. We document some basic price studied statistics, and then we attempt to calibrate a model to the pre-COVID data and find that we can't match the recent patterns of the frequency of price changes.
Great. Thanks for very interesting work. So maybe now we can start with the Q&As. And maybe Gillian, I can start like kind of like you can maybe start answer some of the questions. So actually there are two questions that are kind of similar from Hugh and Dominic. They ask, first, like could change in Republican vote share and holding of war bonds be driven by a confounding variable, for example, latent patriotism? And Dominic asked something like slightly similar, is that basically you have a theory for what drives difference in war bond purchase across areas. Are you thinking that difference in war bond purchase across counties are random after controlling for those observable values, observable in your regression? But I guess like both are asking about like what's like what is behind the war bond purchases.
Sure. So first, the confounding variables. I think the patriotism question came up. There's a reason we use there's two variables from Voth and Capertini that we use to measure patriotism. So World War II volunteer rates and World War II medals per capita. And when we add those, it doesn't really change our results. So we're pretty sure it's not latent patriotism, at least to the extent we can measure it. I think, and I should also say, like, there's one of like, oh, could you use like share of people who hold a bond? I wish historical data could do that, but we don't have that. All we have is the dollar amount of bond purchases per county for 1 year for 1944. If we wanted to go to state level, we could do monthly bond purchases by state, but that would only be states. And I think, you don't want to give up the county level variation. We're getting too much from that. In terms of what's driving the variation. So I think we very much believe that there could definitely be, we're trying to control for income and wealth as much as we can by, say, controlling for deposits beforehand. And, we have median income from the full count census by county, but surely we're not measuring those things perfectly, and they are almost certainly do matter. But the fact that we see so much larger coefficients on our bond purchases than we see on the bank deposit flows, which should, for the most part, have the same biases driving both of them, that tells us, that's why we're convinced that there's something real going on there. In terms of what we think is really driving the variation, I mean, the idea of the IV is really using kind of this variation in strength of kind of civic organization and how well, like, how good are your community service organizations? How well organized, are at this point, all the upper class women who don't work and who, organize volunteer things in their spare time. A lot of them had done a lot of work in the World War I bond drives. It's things like your Lions Club and your Kiwanis Club and your Rotary, all of those organizations. And that we may well be picking up something about kind of strength of the social fabric and social ties in a place. There are things like some areas use an allocation system where they basically assign every household, this is how much you owe, and go door to door demanding it. And then there are places that don't do that. And so we think that variation really is quasi-random. And that's part of why we like the IV, which again gives us stronger results, if anything. But I think there's room to think about other things going on, and we'd be very interested. We're getting ready to submit this paper, but we haven't done it yet. So if you have thoughts, all three of us would be happy to hear them.
Thanks, Gillian. Maybe we can switch to a couple of questions for Hugh. So Dominic asked, it seems like price changes become more common before inflation rises. Is this because the CPI is slow to to increase because of lags due to housing inflation. And actually, if I can add something, like it seems that also like kind of price, like kind of like frequency, like stay relatively high at the end. So like, is this also like maybe it's too soon to tell, but is this like an indication that maybe like we have a more flexible price and more like flexible economy given this high inflation? Like, and we can think about more permanent effect.
Yeah, I think those are both good questions. I think that looking at the here, looking at the graph, sorry to be so bold, of the CPI and the frequency, the CPI increase seems to lead the uptick in frequency in 2021 and then lag it in 2023. So I'm not sure if there's a consistent pattern across the entire time series. I do think that there's an interesting point about maybe we should be recreating this graph using the CPI X shelter rate, just so that there's more consistency between our pricing statistics and our CPI rate. And then in terms of, yeah, I think it would be interesting if there was some sort of a scarring effect going on where the future firms allocate more attention to inflation, even if their inflation rate. That would be an interesting case for the long-term implications of a brief inflation episode. And I'm sure in like 10 or 20 years, that's going to be a really interesting paper.
Thanks. Actually, that's related also to another point of Dominic, like what about firms' inflation expectation? Basically, do you think that is driving a little bit part of the effect or not?
I think that is a good question, and I need to sit down and think about those implications a bit. My expectation is that my hunch is that if firms believe that the inflation rate will keep rising, then what they would be tempted to overshoot their optimal prices a bit, because they expect that the inflation rate is going to drive up all the other prices and eventually catch up to their new target. That's what I expect to see in the data. I think in the model, we would have to incorporate a more complex nominal aggregate demand process.
Thanks. And actually, like just as a small promotion, the Gillian Fed, we have a survey of inflation expectation, and we see some lagging effect. And maybe finally, Gillian, I also have like a small question for you. So I guess like kind of like there might be two effects here. One is kind of like people being upset because of inflation, but also like kind of some wealth effect that might reduce economic activity at the local level. Usually like kind of people would kind of like penalize more the incumbent. So can you separate a little bit? And this is a question that was there, like between like switcher between one party and the other, or like kind of like, or you can control by any economic activity effect that maybe that can explain like the big effect that you have. So from one side they're sad, but on the other side they're more pessimistic, and they kind of like the lower economic activity then change the voting behavior.
So we're controlling for things like war production spending that are going to be. We're controlling for most of the things that are kind of measures of the direct economic shock of the war, and how much economic activity is going on. So I think we're capturing that stuff quite well, and we see strong effects of those variables. There's some very big urban-rural differences, but again, we have controls for those things. It's also just really hard to think about that time period compared to others, because the household consumption and saving options in a wartime environment are not normal options. You can't buy durable goods because there's rationing, and because almost every single firm producing durable goods has switched to producing war goods. And so like you can't buy a car because every auto factory in the US has switched to war production. But it's not just cars. You can't buy a toaster or a hairdryer or a typewriter or boots. Like there's all of these things, basically no household appliances. So you can go to the movies, but how much can you manage to spend at the movies? Right. There's, normally we see durables respond much more than non-durables to income shocks, and households can't do that. And similarly, the options for what to do with assets are limited because housing construction is also highly limited by the war. You can't go out and build a house. I have another paper I've been working on. It's probably going to take me a while to get there on, you know, how all this wartime saving kind of fueled the post-war housing boom, and that we see in the later 1940s, huge increases in housing construction coming out of this that is very much correlated with where savings rates are higher. But people can't in the moment move into other assets. And so it's nice for us, given like data quality issues using historical data, because your choices really are mostly like bank deposits, cash, bonds, life insurance. There's very low participation in the stock market. There's some, but it's low because you're right after the Great Depression. And so people are kind of scarred and avoiding that. But it's just a very strange economic environment in terms of the choices people have. And, you know, in that way, that's one of the reasons I like that we can think about, well, what's the longer term effect of this? Is the war itself is such a strange thing that you can think of it as being this shock. And yes, there's a lot of dimensions to it, but it really is kind of a shock happens where, you know, without World War II, you don't get any of this stuff. And then afterwards, you end up with, you know, people get very angry. And so I think there is an element to which, and a lot of that, we have a lot of evidence from work by Price Fishback and Taylor Jaworski and others that a lot of the economic impact of the war, like the direct economic impact, is very short-lived, and that a lot of it really vanishes. It's gone by like 1950. You don't see higher employment, higher output in places that had more war production because it all gets undone. Yeah. And so it's better than it might seem, but only because it's such a weird environment.
Of course, yes. Well, that's very interesting, and still like a lot of implications for today's situation. But yeah, like we're a little bit out of time, so thanks a lot everybody for attending this very interesting session. So just as a heads up, like on May 2nd, we're gonna have Jesus Fernandez Villaverde presenting Navigating by Falling Stars, Monetary Policy and Fiscally Driven Natural Rates, and also we're gonna have Florin Vivier presenting Greed, Profit, Inflation, and Aggregate Demand, and how Montag is going to be the moderator. So thanks a lot, everybody, for being here, and yeah, see you next time.
Thank you.